much for the warm welcome. Excited to be here with you to talk about universal screening. My name is Katie, and just wanted to get a sense of who is in this session. How many of you are classroom teachers? A couple teachers, great. How many folks are school social workers? School psychologists? School counselors? Great. Got all our school mental health folks. Building administrators, principals, district administrators, state level leaders. Wonderful. Any nurses or special educators? Great. And then who did I miss? Got everyone? All right, wonderful. I shared with the session this morning that I'm really happy to be back in Nebraska, although I spent most of my childhood in Denver, Colorado, where I grew up. Both of my parents are from Nebraska, and both of them grew up outside of Omaha. My dad grew up in Elkhorn, and my grandmother was a teacher for 25 years at Skyline Elementary School in that area. And then my mom grew up on a farm outside Arlington, Nebraska, if you know where that is, a little town outside of Omaha. And my grandparents were farmers there until their 70s. So we spent a lot of time in my childhood driving from Denver to Omaha to visit aunts and uncles and cousins and things. So really nice to be back. So very excited to talk to you about screening. Our goals for today will be to talk about evidence-based screening measures and procedures, including some ethical and legal considerations that we'll talk about today. We will also talk about how to examine racial and ethnic disparities in screening data. So making sure that your screening data is has an equity focus to it and how you're aggregating and analyzing data. And then certainly want to help you be able to use a decision-making framework for how you use screening data to connect to other assessments and interventions that you might be using. A little bit about my background. I started out my career working in schools for about a decade before I came into academia. I worked primarily with middle school and high school youth and really found that a lot of the kids I was working with had significant behavioral and mental health concerns that warranted support, and really found a passion for screening as one way to engage in early identification and intervention of behavioral and mental health needs. So I've been engaged in research on universal screening for about the past decade and seen it change a lot during that time. It's much more common now than it used to be, even though data is still showing only about 20% of schools are doing screening for behavior. That has grown from probably 2 or 3% about a decade ago. So it's growing, but a little bit slower rate than what we see with academic screening data. All right, so the evolution of treatment. 2000 BC, here, eat this root. 1000 AD, that root is heathen, here, say this prayer. 1850 AD, that prayer is superstition, here, drink this potion. 1920 AD, that potion is snake oil, here, swallow this pill. 1965 AD, that pill is ineffective, here, take this antibiotic. And 2080, that antibiotic is artificial, here, eat this root. So I like this slide in terms of, I think initiatives and education are similar in that we haven't moved that far away from where we've started. A lot of things come full circle in education. I remember when I interviewed for my job at Wisconsin about 5 years ago, I was looking at the history of school mental health research and faculty that had been there since they had the program in the 60s. It had started in the 1960s. And there was a book that came out by one of the faculty called School Mental Health, right? And we think that mental health is new in schools, but really it's been around for quite some time. And so really thinking about how we might use what we already do, but do it in new and better and different ways, hopefully to help support kids. So the World Health Organization has defined the current state of child and adolescent mental health as a public health crisis. They've indicated that child neuropsychiatric disorders are now one of the 5 most common causes of morbidity, mortality, and disability. I mentioned this in my talk this morning, but in our lab, we talk about this 20/20 phenomena, that 20% of kids will have some type of mental health concern throughout their school trajectory, warranting help and support. However, only 20% of that group actually receive services for their needs. We have a large gap of kids who need services and those who actually receive them, which probably isn't a surprise to any of you who work in schools that that's happening. We also know in the identification of behavior concerns that we're maybe not doing a great job currently. The United States is one of the most racially, ethnically, linguistically, and culturally diverse countries. And students from historically minoritized populations now make up over 50% of our school-age population, with projected increases. However, we know that our teaching and our educator workforce is predominantly white and female. And you can see that, I think, at this conference, that that's the case. And it certainly is the case in my field, in the field of school mental health and school psychology. We know that when we look at kids who are struggling, kids who are having mental and behavioral health concerns, we know that there's a disproportionate number of students from minoritized backgrounds who are identified for services due to an emotional disability. So African and American and Black students are over-identified, and we know that our Hispanic and Latinx students are underrepresented. Certainly, school demographics, systemic factors contribute to a lot of these disparities. There's a differential impact of poverty on students from minoritized backgrounds. And we also see that English language learners are at a higher risk of demonstrating behavioral concerns, often based on discriminatory factors that they experience based on linguistic concerns. So why is this a problem, right? We see that students who have mental and emotional behavioral concerns have poor school-related and long-term outcomes. So these are students who are often suspended or expelled at higher rates, often aren't at school, have a higher incidence of contact with the juvenile justice system, lower graduation rates, and generally poor psychosocial outcomes. But we know when we focus on improving social emotional learning and we focus on promoting mental health and mental wellness, that kids do better at school, right? They are more engaged at school. They're happy to be there. They're more likely to participate. And they show demonstrated or increases in motivation and commitment to learning. So there is a reason why we want to assess kids' behavioral and emotional functioning and determine how this can help them do better at school. We also see that social, emotional, and behavioral competence is a mediator. So we know that high quality classroom instruction, right, what all of you do very well, hopefully in your schools, can lead to kids experiencing academic skill growth and hopefully academic achievement. However, we know that kids' social, emotional, and behavioral competence, right, has a direct impact on that, how they do in the classroom and their academic skill growth over time. So it's important for us to think about social, emotional, and behavioral concerns and what are those barriers to learning for kids that might keep them from being successful in the classroom. So there's not a pyramid on this slide or triangle, but did want to integrate where this fits within multi-tiered systems of support. PBIS, right, is one of the most common multi-tiered systems of support with an overarching goal of decreasing externalizing problems and a goal of increasing positive social behavior, which is great. We've found ways over the last few years, most notably, to be able to also integrate social emotional learning to that model with a goal of decreasing internalizing problems and increasing social emotional skills. So when we think about behavior screening, it's important to think about that in a larger model of what we're doing as a system to help support kids. So on the right here, certainly many of you are familiar with a PBIS approach, but then also thinking about how social emotional learning really fits into these components when we think about mental health and mental wellness, with the goal really being on prevention and early intervention. This is a slide of, this is my daughter. She's in kindergarten now, but when she was in preschool was during the pandemic or during lockdown. And she had to wear a mask to school for about 2 years of preschool. And they gave out this book when the kids went back, which I thought was really cool, to help the kids and and they sent this home to help the kids and the teachers know who the kids were, right? And it was a flip book, and it had pictures of all their teachers with masks, and it had a picture of the teachers without their masks. And I just thought, it was like, who's hiding behind this mask? And they made it kind of a cute, like, kids book, right? It's Ellie. And so again, thinking about what is prevention and early intervention strategies that really connect in the setting and place where you are. So when you think about your own setting, what are some of the methods by which you might know which kids need additional help and support? So as you think about behavioral and mental health concerns of kids, what are methods of early identification you have in your school? Anyone? Okay, yes. Teacher referral, number one. Good job. So yes, teacher referrals. What else? How else do you know about kids who might need help? Yeah. So a parent might say, hey, my kid seems to seem like they're struggling or need some support. Can you help? Okay, grades or attendance. So extant data that you might have available at your school. Office referrals. Yeah. Pediatric setting. So maybe a parent, right, talk to their child's primary care physician. Anybody ever get, I got a script once, please give this kid a 504 from the doctor's office. You ever get those? Yeah. Yeah. So maybe a referral to the school from the doctor's office. Y'all are at an MTSS conference, right? That uses data, problem solving teams, right? So maybe you have ready-made referral pathways that are at your school for how we identify kids who are struggling. Hopefully you have a school psychologist and social worker more than a day a week at your school, or school counselors who are there full time to support kids. We know that that has a direct impact on the number of kids who receive services and are referred for services, and then certainly parent referral. So the number one way that that evidence has shown is teacher referral, and is the number one strategy. We know that because of traditional refer, test, place models, that we often rely on teachers to signal, hey, the student is struggling, can I get some help and support? However, we know sole reliance on that is problematic for a number of reasons. Not because teachers aren't doing a good job. I think teachers are amazing. I think it's the hardest job in the world, and I have the utmost respect. Teachers really differ in their ability to work with students. Our pre-service training programs are vastly different in terms of what kind of training folks get ahead of time. There's a great article that came out in the 1980s by Gerber and Semmel that talks about perceptions of teachability, that when teachers go into the field, they have an idea of the types of students that they can connect with and what the classroom experience is going to look like. And oftentimes that ends up being very disparate from what they experience when they step into the room. And after 5 to 10 years of teaching, that changes. I know the graduate students I have now are very different than they were when I started a decade ago. And the things that they need look different and feel different. And so that requires us to change and to know how to best meet their needs. I don't know if we often always do a great job of training teachers to know how problematic a behavior might need to be prior to referral. I think about an elementary school I worked at as a school psychologist, and I had 2 kindergarten teachers, both who had been in the profession for over 20 years. Both were seasoned teachers. And one teacher had the mentality of, I want to take care of my own. This is the first time that many of the kids have been in a formal school setting. It's my job to teach them to learn how to recognize their letters, to do letter sound fluency, to learn how to read. And so she didn't really reach out to folks in the school for support. And that wasn't bad. It was just her kind of mentality of like, these are my kids. And she had a really welcoming and lovely environment. The next teacher, also very welcome and lovely and positive environment, but probably referred about half of her kids for special ed evaluation before the end of the year, right? And so you just see these differences in classrooms, and any of you who've worked in schools know that's the case. And so we see that oftentimes, just depending upon the teacher and the dynamics and how they access support, that kids really receive help at different rates. A study came out a few years ago that showed that for kids that looked at data across the last decade and showed that for kids who have academic concerns, from the time they have a concern to when they receive help and support is, what would you say is the average rate? 1 year, 10 years, 20 years? What do you think? It's 1 to 3 years. For behavioral and social emotional concerns, 5 to 7 years later. So a large gap and difference between behavior concerns and academic concerns. Okay, so you all aren't here to admire the problem, right? Which we do a very good job of in education, right? We're here to solve it. And so want to spend the rest of the session certainly talking about screening and how we can use that data to support kids. So universal screening is seen in a public health model as being a population-based service delivery model of how do we screen all kids in a school to determine which kids might need help or support. And the screeners should hopefully be capturing internalizing as well as externalizing behaviors. Much of our research has shown that, and I say our collectively, that across our country, screeners have been able to show 6 years later which kids were involved in mental health, special ed, or juvenile justice. We did a study that showed using the SABRs that fall screening scores were able to predict which kids were struggling with in reading and office discipline referral data and absences. And that screening scores can improve the prediction of students with a heightened risk for negative academic outcomes. We also have looked at some comparisons between screening versus traditional teacher referral or nomination, and shows screening actually identifies more kids. And screening, when compared to office discipline referral data, has shown that it reduces racial disproportionality relative to other methods. So, and I'll share some of that data with you today. But I am curious, how do you identify which kids in your school are at risk or need help? So think about where you fit in this process. A, do you have no structured process? You might wait for a parent or teacher to raise concerns. B, perhaps you use existing data such as office discipline referrals, attendance data, or do you have a formal screening process in place where you might use the SABRs or the SSBD or SRSS, all of our acronyms, to screen your students? So how many people would say A? Maybe no process, and that's okay. This is super variable. B, somewhat structured, you're monitoring data. And then what about C? Okay, great. So it looks like mostly B and C with a couple A's. Those of you who are using screeners, what measures are you do you have in place at your schools? The DESA, okay. SABRs, I think SABRs pretty common. SABRs is part of FastBridge learning. So if you're using FastBridge for academics, that's their behavior companion. Others? SRSS, okay, great. Wonderful. So lots of familiarity, which is great. If you're not using screening or you've been thinking about it more formally, right, just to briefly, I just have a couple slides on like nuts and bolts and best practice considerations, right, of why would we screen. Screening can really be conducted at many different levels. So I've seen schools start with screening of a classroom or a grade level, right? It could happen school-wide, maybe at one school in your district, to determine how it works if you haven't done it before. I think the biggest fear in screening that folks have is what happens if we identify like 40% of our kids? There's no way we have enough services to provide support for 40% of our student population, and we don't have enough mental health support, which I don't know why anybody would. So folks can choose to start small to see how it goes and what it looks like in your school. It typically happens 1 to 3 times per year, so it could align with academic benchmark data that you might be using or academic screening data. But we recommend that folks wait at least 4 to 6 or 4 to 8 weeks into the year, especially if you're relying on teachers to provide data on their students. There are a number of different types of measures out there, or multi-informant measures that can really get at teachers, would have teachers be the raters of their students in their class. That might have parents rate their students or have students rate themselves. We found that teachers tend to be good informants of kids at the elementary level. They have a pretty good idea of normative behavior at each grade level. But as kids get older and learn to read, they have a good recognition of their own mental health and behavioral functioning. And so at the secondary level, as you move into middle schools and high schools, we really recommend schools explore using student self-report data and having students screen themselves, or even in some of the upper elementary grades. So just, and sometimes there's some difficulty with external observations, right? So this says how to recognize the moods of an Irish setter. Happy, depressed, angry, pensive, like might look the same. This is our dog Maya, and she looks like this all the time, right? Even after she ate a whole bag of chocolate Hershey's Kisses at Christmas. And we had to take her to get her stomach pumped because they had almonds in them and dogs can't have that. She still was this happy because she was at the vet and they were paying attention to her. So we know that when we have teachers rate, right, and we think about internal and external behaviors, it sometimes can be difficult for them to have a full grasp or understanding about internalizing type behaviors. And so oftentimes having students rate themselves provides a different piece of data that we may not otherwise have access to in some of our existing data. It's also important to think about messaging around screening, that it fits into existing sources of data and it fits into your system. So before you screen, you want to be able to think about, what are we going to do with this data when we have it? How are we going to help connect kids with services once we have this available to us? But I've seen schools do a good job of really messaging around to parents, why are we doing this? Our school screens for learning, including vision, hearing, academics, and behavior, right? To normalize this, that this is a part of a system-wide process that we have in place of at our school. And that schools work to address the behavioral and academic needs of our students, that if your student is having any behavioral and mental health concerns, that we are able to identify that and recognize it. All right, so based on some of the information that you've heard so far, what other existing questions do you have about screening or that you were hoping to learn in coming today? Mm-hmm. It's like you have my slides. It's the next slide. Like I haven't talked about screening before. Okay, so this is guidance that was put out by the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. That's our Department of Education at the state level, around is parental consent required for behavior screening? And I put the language up here because I think it's really helpful to unpack. And I'm happy to read it. It just says in general, no. Behavior screening that gathers information by reviewing existing data or gathering input from teachers or other educators does not require parental consent. And they give some examples of what that might include, meaning no direct contact with a student. So having a teacher, right, part of normal educational practices that we do this, that we gather data from teachers, may not require parental consent. Does that mean you shouldn't tell your parents you're doing it? No. It means you could provide maybe an informational letter home or an opt-out procedure the first time that you do it, and then look at how would we embed this language in our school handbook or in our school procedures so that it's normalized and standardized and folks know that it's happening, right? So certainly making sure parents know that it's happening and have the ability to not have their child participate if they don't want. But the guidance of Wisconsin and other states that we've worked with and at the federal level, I think really align with this as you think about teacher screening, okay? The next slide talks about students. And folks often bring up PPRA, or the Pupil Protection Rights Amendment, protection of pupil rights. Requires, their language is that they require consent to be obtained before students are given a psychiatric or psychological examination or test in which the primary purpose is to reveal mental and psychological problems that might be potentially embarrassing. So this applies to behavioral health surveys and assessment tools. If a school district requires a student to participate, active consent must be obtained. But if a school does not require a student to participate, i.e. they're allowed to decline, then passive consent may be used rather than active consent. Now, states are different, so it might be different here in Nebraska. And I'm looking at your district folks, cue me in, but most often districts are making decisions about how they want to handle consent, but certainly notifying parents and giving them the option to opt out, I would say seems to be best practice across both parent and student screening, and not forcing students to fill out a measure if they don't want to. Do you want to add anything to that? Okay. Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that. Does that answer your question? I get it, some of the pieces around it. Other questions that folks were hoping to learn about? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is great. It's like I put plants in the audience. I really did it, but this is perfect because this is like literally the next slide if you come and look at this. So yeah, I think that it's a great question of like, what are you screening for? And it's important that your screener matches what you want to know, right? So if you haven't done screening, I would recommend that you look at a few different measures and you get a group together to really determine, is what we're asking, right, is what we want to know what we're asking, and vice versa. So this was Soldo and Romer put this out. My colleague Shannon Soldo has done a lot of great work in this area too. But we know that when we think about mental health, we have to think about not only concerns, but also competencies, right? And so some of the better measures out there, I think, do a good job of including both positively and negatively worded items and assess both student competencies and student concerns. And so this gets at, hey, here are some concerns that we might want to be screening for, as well as, do we want to know more about students' social emotional well-being and competencies that they have? So some measures do that better than others, but again, it's really looking at what you want to know. And I'll give you examples of 2 different measures here in a minute so we can look at those together. Other questions before we go on? Yes. I'm guessing. We'll be 3 for 3.
As districts are looking at implementing screeners, should they also be looking at implementing some decision rules, for lack of a better term?
Mm-hmm.
The trainer tells us this could potentially be handled. School counselor tells us
Yeah.
this, and we're referral with mental health, we're school psychologist, but it tells us this, it's maybe a referral to an outside agency.
Yeah.
So the question is decision rules.
Yeah.
Should that be a part of this conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's decision rules. Yes, I think, and I'll give you a framework here in just a minute. It's not the next slide, but I'll give you some ideas of, hey, if we have this percentage of kids, what might need to be our next step. But I think it's important to think about the strengths on your team, right? I can think about, like, I've worked as partners with school counselors, social workers, psychs, and every team I've worked with has different strengths, right, that people bring, and different things that people like. Like, some school counselors run groups and do classroom-wide lessons. Other counselors are trained to do college and career planning. Same with social workers or psychs, right? Some psychs are doing primarily special ed evals and really involved more with assessment than they are with feeling competent running groups or doing, right, mental health. But others, it's the opposite. So I think it depends on the strengths of your team too, and having a conversation about that ahead of time. Yeah. Okay. So in the interest of time, I'll keep going. But when you think about a screening measure, really thinking about what should a good screener be. So I'll start by saying screening's not diagnostic. It does not diagnose or tell us if a child has a mental health disorder or condition. It's really just meant to be a red flag indicator that something's going on with a student and we need to follow up. And so I like to tell parents that and teachers that, because I think folks say like, this is going to tell us what to do, or this is going to tell us exactly what's going on. And that's not really its intended purpose. It's meant to be quick and hopefully quick and efficient. So only a couple minutes per student, especially if you're having teachers fill it out. It's meant to assess key variables. So we hope that it can get at key domains of functioning, so you don't have to do multiple screeners, that it can look at both externalizing, internalizing social behavior, emotional behavior, because we know if we miss one, we're going to miss an entire class of students who might need supports. I would say I'd say most of the better measures that are out there look at both student strengths and weaknesses. We know that we can best predict future behavior concerns by considering both problems and competencies. It's not really enough to know if social and emotional problems are present. We also need to know if competencies are absent. So that's what I think about in a good screener. And then those that are highly psychometrically sound, right? That they're valid, reliable, and diagnostically accurate, and hopefully can predict both the presence and absence of a problem. All right, and I'm not going to spend today necessarily diving into this. I do like I've done a half day where we kind of get into like positive predictive values, and but if you have questions about that, I'm happy to sort that out. I would just say, if you're a person that does read the manual and looks at the research, for screeners, really look at not only do we want to think about in assessment tools validity and reliability, but for screening tools, look at sensitivity and specificity. Those two words are different for screening than they are for other assessment measures, and those should be at 0.7 or above is kind of the gold standard. So sensitivity and specificity are what you might want to cue into. Okay, so these are just a few universal screening measures that are out there. It doesn't mean these are the only ones, but these are a few that do have good evidence to support their use in schools with children. So I'll walk through two of these today just because we have limited time and I want to spend more time kind of talking about what do you do with your data. But the student risk screening scale, the SRSS, has been adapted with Kathleen Lane and colleagues. She's at the University of Kansas, which now includes internalizing items. And then the SDQ has been used. They have available for free in multiple languages all over the world. So that's one that's, my colleague likes to say Googleable, like you can Google it and find it and get it for free, but is another one that does have a lot of evidence to support its use. So the two I'll show you, if you haven't seen screeners, the first is the Behavioral and Emotional Screening System, or the BESS, BASC-3 BESS. It's a shorter form of the BASC. It's 25 to 30 items, and they have both parent, teacher, and student forms. It gives you an overall behavioral and emotional risk index. So the TPS stands for teacher, parent, student. So it tells you what subscale for each of the different raters. And then it also gives you internalizing and externalizing. So even though it's not diagnostic, it does give you an idea in what domain might be most problematic for a student. And that in itself can help make some decision rules about, okay, as in this classroom, in this grade, or at my school, what tends to be more prevalent? What types of concerns might we see based on some of these subscale scores? And that can guide good systems level discussions. And then they also have some other subscales here about adaptive risk, self-regulation, and personal adjustment. The second measure is the SABRS, or the Social, Academic, and Emotional Behavior Risk Screener. This is a 19-item teacher rating scale, so a little bit shorter than the BESS. And it gives you an overall total behavior score, and then it provides 3 subscale scores of social, behavior, academic, and emotional. The social behavioral domain measures externalizing problems as well as how kids get along with peers and adults. The academic domain doesn't measure academic skills. It's more about academic enablers. So kids' organization, kids' engagement at school, and if there's attention concerns. And then the emotional behavior domain looks at internalizing behaviors and emotional competence. And I know there's a few people in here who have some use with that or experience with that. Any questions about those two? All right. And if you have specific questions or want to see a sample of any of these after, I'm happy to have you take a look. I would say in general, these two have items on them that include behaviors that you're likely to see at school. They are, I would say, more school-friendly measures. So once you get data back, so after you screen, important to think about how you align this data with data that you might already have present at your school. So thinking about attendance data, perhaps number of excused absences, number of moves, looking at academic outcomes, what are growth on CBMs, your benchmark assessment data, standardized test scores, grades, or office discipline referral data, and really determine how you would aggregate these sources of data into one. I don't have it on here, but we've used spreadsheets with schools before that has all classroom data, all aligned for all kids across each of these domains so that and that's color coded of which kids are in the at-risk or significantly at-risk range across both academic and behavior domains, because that helps us as a system determine where we're focusing resources, right? And making sure that those pieces are in alignment. It's also important if you're going to screen to think about how you're going to use the data. So I think the default assumption for most when they think about screening, because this is how we've operated in schools for a long time, is to think about, okay, if this kid screens positive, that means that they need individual counseling. And that's not actually what it needs. They might need that. You might come to learn that they would benefit from that, but it's not actually what it tells us. It tells us much more, I think, about what as a school might be something that we want to focus on or that we want to think about at a grade level or in a classroom. And it also tells us a lot about the prevalence of mental health concerns in a larger community. So thinking about, right, so going back to maybe your Psych 101 class or thinking about Bronfenbrenner and ecological systems perspective, really thinking about screening beyond just the individual level piece, and that's important, but also thinking about more of the systems wide support too. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, no, I can definitely do that. I will probably do that at the end because it'll just require me to get out of here, but yes, otherwise I can do that. So as we think about this, and I give this quote, Kimber Van Nest, if you know her, she's at the University of Vermont in their special ed department, but she had this in one of her presentations, and I just thought it was so relevant. Like, how do we get to tier 2 efforts? So at your school, is tier 2 intended as prevention, or is tier 2 another name for pre-referral documentation? I'm missing a word there. So I know a lot of schools, and this is places that I've worked where people are like, has it been 6 to 8 weeks? Do we get to test the student for special ed, right? Because we know that's how they're receiving services. And so really thinking about when you're using screening, is that guiding some of the tier 2 with the hope that, right? And the intention that if we have high quality tier 2, that's not the end game, or the end goal should not be necessarily special education assessment or evaluation. It's certainly important and is absolutely relevant and necessary for some, but just not for, hopefully, for all. Okay, so as you think about your universal screening data, similar to a PBIS framework where hopefully in your school thinking about like an 80% model where universally can we meet the needs of 80% of our students, we've tried to conceptualize screening in a similar fashion. So for example, if you're in a classroom and you screen, you give, let's say, an oral reading fluency measure to a second grade class, and 15 out of 22 of your kids come up as below grade level, what would you do? Like, what might be some ideas you'd have for intervention? Okay, change what's happening at tier 1. Any ideas of what that may include? Anybody? So you would probably rely on like classroom wide, right? So you might think about classroom-wide, what are we doing for core reading instruction? What do we need to do to go back to think about like components of literacy instruction in that classroom? We wouldn't pull all of those students out for individual instruction, right? When we think about behavior screening, I think it's important to think about that in the same way. If over 20%, so school-wide base rate is a fancy way of saying what percentage of kids are at risk. So if we were to screen all of our students and over 20% of our population was at risk, we'd want to think about what are we doing at tier 1, right? What do our universal supports look like? Similar, and maybe alongside that, a companion piece would be if we screen and we have classes where over 20% of the kids are at risk, how might we think about class-wide intervention? What might be happening in that specific classroom? And really, not that we can't pay attention to individual needs, but this should be a later consideration, individual and small group intervention, right? So that when school-wide and class-wide base rates are lower, at that point, really thinking more about individual and small group intervention for those services. And let me give you some examples of what that might look like. So on the left side of that flow chart, and this is just part of it for visualization purposes, if you have over 20% of your kids in your school that you screen and are at risk, really thinking about based on your data. So many of you gave the example of the sabers that you're using at your school, looking at what type of risk is most prevalent. So do you see social behavior concerns as being most prominent? Perhaps at that point, then you would review and revise school-wide expectations or your reinforcement plan, right? To ensure it's being implemented with integrity. If you would see it happens to actually be more emotional or internalizing behavior concerns, then you might think about how would we implement social emotional learning for all of our kids? Would there be a good path forward for us to start implementing that universally in our classrooms to start to address some of those needs early on? Some universal curriculum, and we could spend probably a full day talking about universal and targeted interventions. But certainly relying on some of these repositories to help you come up with what might be evidence-based programs. So CASEL has a list of safe and sound programs. SAMHSA has a national registry of evidence-based programs and practices. And then the IES What Works Clearinghouse has done that for a period of time, including the EBI network at the University of Missouri had that going for a while. I'm not quite sure if it's still running, but they have many of the same resources you'd find on these top 3. So when we think about social emotional learning programs that are out there, some of the evidence-based ones, Second Step, promoting alternative thinking strategies, Why Try, Incredible Years. I'd also probably add like Strong Start or Strong Kids, Strong Teens curriculum out of the University of Oregon. They have some great universal that also targets some internalizing behaviors for kids, but those might be some good places to start. Any other universal curricula or evidence-based programs y'all are using or really like right now? No, okay, that's all right. You got more work to do, it's good. Okay, so we talked about school-wide. And again, just giving some initial strategies and ideas of what to do with your data. What do we do if classroom base rates look like this? So this was at an elementary school that we worked with. And you can see the number of total students who are screened in those classrooms, that anywhere from like 20 to 28 kids per class, and the number of students who screened positive. And this was data we shared back with the school. And the first thing the principal said when we sat down was about Sarah Schaefer, and obviously we changed their names, but said, this is a first-year teacher and there's major classroom management issues in this room. And so it's not that there wasn't students in that room who were at risk or that the teacher perceived as having behavior concerns, but the reaction and response to those data looked different, right? Based on contextual factors. And so that's where I think this ecological approach is really important, because it's not enough to just say, okay, we have this list of however many kids who've screened positive, and here's what we're going to do with all of them. Like each kid in each classroom has unique needs, And so really having an assessment of the ecology of that classroom is going to help you know how to better respond. And that's where screening can sometimes get a little tricky. It's not necessarily, again, your initial response shouldn't be, okay, this kid needs individual mental health support, but more around how do we systematically structure or support this teacher? And that's not to say like the teacher was doing something wrong, but how we're going to respond to that classroom and teacher is different. The other thing I'll point out is I was, as a school psychologist at one of my buildings, I was often involved in placement of kids in classrooms, right? And seeing who's going to be in what class and what teacher is going to be best with which students. And like we had a second grade teacher who was awesome with kids who had more behavioral challenges. So she got a lot of kids with behavior challenges in her classroom. Like that was real. And so some of these teachers here, the teacher I worked with, she probably had 7 to 10 kids every year who we would say had more behavioral concerns because she was really good at working with them and connected well with those students. And so I think it's also thinking about what additional supports do we provide to teachers like that, to not say it's totally on their shoulders to continue to support their kids too. Okay. So at the classroom level, certainly there's a number of other classroom-wide interventions that you might want to think about or consider. If you're giving the SABRs, and again, over 25% or 20% of the students might be screening positive, really thinking about things like, so the classroom checkup would be an example, or the good behavior game. Good behavior game's been around for a long time. Many of you probably hopefully got some instruction on that in graduate school, but some token reinforcement systems. Classroom checkup is an intervention developed by Wendy Reinke and Keith Herman and Randy Sprick. Really focuses on it's a classroom consultation model. So it uses principles of motivational interviewing to have a consultant like a social worker, counselor, psych, go in and work with the teacher to determine what is going well and what areas of your classroom might you be struggling, and what is a plan that we can come up with together to support you. So that first teacher we were talking about, Sarah Schaefer, classroom checkup might be really great for her to get some additional consultation and support about how to improve behavior supports for kids in that class. If you see, based on screening data, that in one particular classroom, academic behaviors might be a concern, perhaps suggesting classroom instruction of various academic enablers. So are the kids is there a good system for organization in the classroom? What does preparedness for instruction look like? And then how do we promote instructional practices in the class? So what does pace of instruction look like? What are the opportunities for kids to learn? Some of the resources that I'm talking about here that I was just talking about are on this slide. So classroom checkup, here's the citation for that. Good behavior game has lots of resources out here. This is one place where you can learn more about it. Brandy Simonson has done a lot of work on classroom management and how to give kids like a self-assessment and offer some ideas about instructional practices. And then certainly some other books and resources out there on how to promote and support teachers in the classroom. Okay, so at that same school, the second half of the teachers, this is what their data look like. And I would say on the whole, most schools where we're engaging with screeners, most teachers, I'd say the majority of teachers are identifying 3 to 5 students per class. And so oftentimes they're kids you already know about. They might be kids who are already in special education. I worked in elementary school. We did screening. We had 600 kids. We were on military base. So I worked in Fort Carson Army Base in Colorado Springs. And of the 600 kids, when we screened, we had 60 kids who were identified. So we had about 10% of our student population. And it's a pretty diverse community. The kids move a lot, so they're very transient. But we found that of the 60 kids that we screened, we knew of about 40 of them. 2/3 of them were on our radar. And there was about 20 to 30% of the kids who were new to us that weren't getting some type of help and support. And so typically, if you haven't done screening before, we've seen similar numbers where maybe they are kids who are in special education or receiving support. But as you think about individual supports, I think working with, we don't necessarily have time to get in this today, but doing like a needs assessment or resource mapping can be really helpful with your school-based mental health team to look at, what types of groups are we offering, or what referrals in the community are we thinking about, and are kids accessing those? And if not, what can we spend our time doing instead based on our screening data showing that we have X, Y, and Z type of concerns? The other individual support resources that can be helpful really look at teaching strategies. So how do we instruct on key skills such as social skills, academic enablers, emotional competencies? That might happen through a social skills training or some other tier 2 intervention. This morning, I talked a little bit about our resilience education program, which is a tier 2 intervention we have for kids with internalizing behaviors. So that might be a relevant support for kids who are screening positive for internalizing behaviors. And then you might also think about some of the antecedent consequence strategies. So check in, check out, right? We know, anybody not heard of check in, check out? I'll ask in a different way. Great, awesome. So to be able to prompt and reinforce appropriate behaviors. So again, it's a question of, do the students have the skills to do it and they aren't doing it, so they just need prompting and reinforcement, or do they actually need direct skills instruction to be able to learn some of those key skills? So then the reinforcement and prompting of appropriate behaviors actually works. Okay. So we have about 15, 20 minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about the limits of screening and thinking about screening from an equity perspective. So really thinking about what is the intended and validated purpose of a screener, right? And looking at it, as I mentioned earlier, screeners are not diagnostic, and they really are intended to just signal early signs of risk. We also know that there's treatment utility for different types of decisions that we're making, and that you may need additional data to be able to inform your intervention plan. So that might require, if you have a student who's struggling socially, it might require some type of social skills inventory to determine in what area would intervention be most beneficial or helpful. If you believe a referral to an outside provider would be beneficial, right, based on the services available at school, making sure that you're sending and coordinating helpful services. I know one of the things that we did in a district I worked at, we didn't have good knowledge of, or we didn't have a big resource list or referral list of community service providers. And so on our professional development days, we occasionally would get, like throughout the year, we would get people who'd send us their business card, or we get a flyer about like a new group starting in the community. So we used like an hour or two of our PD one day to come together as counselors, psychs, and social workers and have folks come in to tell us about what they did, right? For whether that was a provider, a private provider, or community mental health agency, for them to come and meet us and us to meet them. And we'd learn about what insurances they took. We'd learn about their specialty. They got to ask us questions about referral procedures. We ended up setting up good documentation around how do we have releases from parents that we can communicate with one another more efficiently. And so setting up some of those things and using that professional development time really helped us when we needed to make referrals to know what were the resources in the community and how could we communicate better when our families were being seen. So being thoughtful about that as well. All right, so a couple pieces that are important to note. The quality of information into the system is directly related to the data produced and the decisions that follow. I think in schools we do a great job of collecting data. I don't know that we actually do always a good job of using what we have, right? Instead of thinking we need to do something more. So if you decide to do screening or have been doing screening, make sure that you train the people who are doing it and you tell them what you're going to do with the data. I think this is especially important for students. We've seen schools where students are being screened and providing data, but then they don't know what happens with that afterwards. And then they come back the next year and we ask them all the same questions. They're like, why am I filling this out? What is this for? And so having some student voice in the process, I think there's been, thankfully at middle schools and high schools, a lot of students who want to talk about mental health and mental health literacy. And so I've seen schools develop teams with their students to have student voice at the table around screening procedures and around how students can share more or how they can signal and access help when they need to. So making sure, again, that we train everyone in what is the content and purpose of screening. Also important that we look at aspects of implicit bias, right? So when we use teachers, especially as raters, we all have implicit bias, right? And certainly some of the data I'm going to show you here will show that's the case. But really looking at disaggregated data to identify what might be inequities in our system and being really transparent with the teachers in your school, if you plan to do that, that's what's going to be happening. So it's not a surprise to anybody. And that's really so that we can help stop that from happening and we can be aware of how our own implicit biases might be impacting our ratings when filling out behavior rating scales or other rating scales asking about student behavior. All right, so as we think about teacher ratings, what does that look like? Research is really mixed right now on rates of identification of minoritized students. We see in the research that some of the studies out there don't see differences in the identification of social, emotional, and behavior risk by race and ethnicity. So the study by Mashburn didn't show a difference in kindergarten students. A recent study by Barger and colleagues were using the SRSS and did not see any measurement in variance by race and ethnicity in elementary students. However, other studies have shown differences. So Joni Splett showed on the BAS3 BEST that Black students were over-identified on that specific measure. And then Weathers did an interesting study looking at racial match between the students and the teachers and how they were evaluating their students, and showed that there were actually increased rates of internalizing concerns when teachers who had the same race and ethnicity as their students were rating students on behaviors, or rating students on their behaviors compared to just white teachers, which was interesting as well. We had two more recent studies, which I'll share with you. I did a study with one of my doctoral students who's now graduated, and we looked at differences on English for English language learners. She was, I think really thoughtful. The research had shown that English language learners actually, their needs are often overlooked. And research has shown that they have more behavioral concerns. We actually found there wasn't a difference between English language learners and English speaking students. But what we did see is that on a sample of kindergarten through 8th grade students, that as students got older, they were more likely to be identified as at risk, which aligns with what we know about mental health concerns, right? That they become more prevalent as kids get older. The second study, that was from a district in the Midwest, not Wisconsin, even though I lived there, looked at the disproportionate identification of behavior concerns. We were really interested in looking at, is there a difference between office discipline referral data, and because many schools use that to identify risk, how does that compare to behavior screening when we're looking at differences in risk and degree in schools? So what we saw that is across the entire district, we did find disproportionality. This looks at odds risk ratio data. And so this shows a significance here, why it's highlighted in red, and that kids from minoritized backgrounds were 1.8 times more likely to be identified as at risk compared to their white peers. And so we decided to look at that based on, like I said before, the difference between office discipline referral data and screening data. And what we found was here, if you look at the district-wide data, if we use screening data, students from minoritized backgrounds were 1.8 times more likely to be identified, but ODRs were nearly 3 times. And so we did see disproportionate identification on both measures, but it seemed to be more significant when just relying on office discipline referral data. The other interesting piece, and this part wasn't something we were planning to evaluate, but came out as we sorted through the data, is that these are just 4 of the schools in that district. These are all elementary schools, and it's all teacher data or teacher screening data. But what we found is in schools where white students were the minority of the student population, we did not see disproportionality happening in the data. The data really varied by schools. But in 2 of the schools where students from minoritized identities were in the minority is where we saw the greatest rates of disproportionality. And so the makeup of the school in that particular district made a big difference. So that's why I think about if you're I would say as a practitioner, if you're a district administrator, look beyond your district averages. If you're a school administrator, look at your differences by grade and by teacher to really look at those odds risk ratios to determine where is it happening and why. What we know from how do we, and then what do we do about it, right? So if this is happening, what do we do about it? Certainly we want to consider if there's a cultural mismatch between your teachers and your students, making sure that teachers have a good understanding of the different cultures and behaviors that might come with students from different identities, and to consider other sources of data following an at-risk rating. So some schools have elected to do both teacher and student screening and to be able to compare those aspects, but certainly calculating risk ratios based on race and ethnicity, or even looking at gender, is important. We found in some of our rating or some of our research that giving teachers corrective feedback and giving teachers training on screening did reduce rates of disproportionality over time, right? And the research shows that to be true on implicit bias. When people have a recognition that they're acting in a biased fashion, people don't, especially teachers, don't want to do that, right? I think folks want to do what's right by kids. And so being able to share their data back with them and to recognize why might that be and what domains of behavior might you be rating certain students higher than others, right? How might we as a collective whole educate ourselves about some of our own implicit biases to make sure that this isn't happening moving forward? Because we know individuals are internally motivated to act in a non-biased manner, right? After they understand why that might have come to be. Also important to think about mental health literacy training. We know that that can be a helpful strategy for teachers understanding more about mental health, period, and specifically additional training on internalizing behaviors, which may be less familiar. So a couple resources I want to share with you before we wrap up today. We created over here a best practices in universal social, emotional, and behavior screening, an implementation guide. And all of that is available on our smhcollaborative.org website. So if you go to smhcollaborative.org, you can find all of these. We also have a consultation resource guide for school teams around screening. And then I mentioned REP, our Tier 2 internalizing intervention, is also on the website. But as part of this screening guide, there are implementation checklists and planning guides for teams that are interested in starting screening or implementing or interested in improving what they have going on. It walks through like exploration, readiness, adoption. Do you have these things in place? Are they partially in place? And then what might be action steps? And it also includes a larger, and I don't expect that you can read some of the text up here. It's good we have this huge screen, but some FAQs around screening so that if you have folks who are part of your team who aren't here with you, this might be a good resource guide, as well as guiding questions for developing a protocol for using SEB data. So why are we implementing screening? What questions are we trying to answer? How have we defined our student universe, meaning all students? What is our measure? What does our SEB screener measure? Then how often are we going to use it? And what does that look like in connecting with a continuum of SEB supports? I will say on a positive note, having universal data can be a really helpful advocacy tool for you to be able to share with your school board or your district administrators about the need for additional mental health supports. I'm completely biased, I'll say, right, that we need more mental health services. I don't think anybody here would disagree, hopefully, but having data to show these are the present, like this percentage of kids in our school community are identifying concerns can be a really helpful tool for increasing supports at school. So we have a book on screening that just came out this last year that Nate and Steve and I wrote on conducting behavioral and social emotional assessments in MTSS, specifically about screening, but also has a lot of information about tier 2 and tier 3. If you're interested in learning more, or universal, it's mostly universal and targeted. There's some tier 3. And then if you have additional questions about screening, procedural, legal, ethical, others, I'm happy to answer. That's my email. And then same with the website that I provided earlier. So we have, actually, I know I talked kind of fast to give us some extra time, but we have some time for questions if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. Okay. I'll be up here afterwards if anybody wants to hang around, but otherwise, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. So this is kind of a messy version. I have a prettier one, but I just can't find it quickly. So this just shows the school. They were using STEEP. This is a district we worked with in Arizona, and their reading benchmark, their math benchmark data, attendance, fall and spring, their ODRs for fall and spring, and then this was their behavior screener. And so 0 was not at risk, 1 was at risk, and 2 was like clinically like severe, extremely elevated. So you can kind of see where it told us kids who were maybe really struggling across the academic and behavioral domains, and then other kids where it was maybe just behavior risk. So I'll leave that up there for a minute.